Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonia Bonellis, and on behalf of the British German Association, I would like to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the BGA is a charity and membership organisation founded 70 years ago that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to provide a vibrant forum for talks, discussions and learning about Germany. So we regularly put on events along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter. This afternoon, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Tiffany Florvil, Associate Professor of 20th Century European Women's and Gender History at the University of New Mexico, and Dr. Kennetta Perry, Director of the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at De Montfort University, Leicester, for talk and conversation about Tiffany's new book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of a Transnational Movement. The book was published with the University of Illinois Press, and it offers the first full-length study of the history of the Black German movement of the 1980s to the 2000s. I've provided a link to the book in the chat box, so please do check it out. I'll just send that now. Before handing over to Tiffany, a quick note on the technology. There will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session at the end of the event, and the Q&A will be conducted via the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you click on it, you can type up and send in questions. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Tiffany.
Thank you, Antonia, for what a lovely welcome and this great invitation. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm particularly excited to be in conversation later with Dr. Kennetta Perry, whose work I have long admired, and I'm just excited to be in conversation with her. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that, more or less? Let's see. I've tried to hide my multiple windows that are open so that no one can see them. So this is certainly the talk that I'm going to give today. I'm drawing from chapter 4 of my book that Antonia just described. And this chapter deals with Black German activist Maya Eam, who was certainly a prominent figure in the movement. It also is a great segue because my new project deals explicitly with Maya Eam, writing a biography on her. So this gives you a little bit of a snippet about her life. So racism and oppression is going to be a current topic in Germany for the foreseeable future, which is both significant and terrifying. However, I do not take it as a reason for resignation, but rather as a challenge to stronger action, including, for example, creating more and better strategies and coalitions, national as well as international. So remarked Maya Eam to a multinational crowd of women of color in Germany at the International 5th Cross-Cultural Black Women's Studies Summer Institute in August of 1991. Here's a program from that institute. In her presentation entitled Racism and Oppression in Unified Germany, Eam, an author and activist of Guyana and German descent and a leading figure in the Afro-German movement, recognized the persistence of racial discrimination in a nation in a reunified Germany that was seeking international stature. Far from being defeatist, Eam thought these challenges should prompt coalitional politics and empowering strategies, themes that the 1991 Institute promoted. Eam's remarks reflected an understanding of how national and international dynamics intersect and connect individuals, and how emotion provided opportunities for activism. Her comments at the 1991 Institute also demonstrate how she used an international event to draw attention to the hardships endured by people of color in Germany. Eam's participation in the Institute marked her increased transnational activism. Today in this talk, I will focus on how Eam's international engagements and organizational commitments pushed her to demand equality for individuals of color and to cultivate connections with many across the Black diaspora, which offered Eam a sense of belonging. These bonds also served as a form of cultural survival in a German nation that excluded and ignored her Afro-Germanness. In this way, Eam's transnational activism made her a Black internationalist and provided her with a platform from which she achieved recognition for herself and other Afro-Germans. Black internationalism, a political, cultural, and intellectual practice against racial oppression, informed both her politics and her poetics. Before I discuss this activism, I'll provide you with a little context about her life. Brigitte Silver-Gurent, nicknamed Mai, was born in Hamburg to Ursula Ampe, a young German woman, and Emmanuel Aim, a Guyanan medical student, on May 3rd, 1960. Her white German mother, like some German mothers of mixed race children, placed her in an orphanage. Mai remained at the children's home for 2 years until a white German couple from Münster adopted her. She joined the Opitz family, which already had children. And as you can see, there's a little image of Mai. She's the only Black German in her class, certainly not uncommon for the time. Aim's adoptive parents were strict in the hopes that she would become a model student in spite of her lineage, which they believed consisted of her allegedly wayward German mother and Guyanan father. Post-war debates about the deviant behavior of German women who lacked respectability and fraternized with African-American GIs were prevalent. These German women were also considered to be of a low social standing. German officials, as well as other ordinary citizens, oftentimes disapproved of these relationships. After spending her youth in the Opitz household, Aim studied and traveled to Israel, Egypt, Kenya, and Ghana, where she connected with her biological father and family. In 1984, at the age of 24, she moved to West Berlin. The city helped her forge ties with other individuals of color, especially Caribbean American poet Audre Lorde. And the sort of bottom image is actually of Lorde in West Berlin. So she's in a park in West Berlin. Lorde was visiting professor in 1984 at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Free University, where she taught 3 courses. Lorde's tenure at the university was due in part to white West German feminist and FU lecturer Dagmar Schultz. One of Lorde's aims with the trip was to meet Black German women. By attending some of these seminars, Aim met other Afro-Germans, including Katarina Oguntoya, who was of Nigerian and East German descent. Aim's and Oguntoya's exchanges with Lorde, and of course each other, helped them cultivate a new diasporic consciousness, one that led to the creation of a new lexicon with the designations of Afro-German, Afro-Deutsche, and Black Germans, Schwarze Deutsche, in which they were self-styling and making their diasporic identity legible. And here is an image of Katharina, Audra, and Mai. Aim, Oguntoya, and other Black Germans established 2 cultural and political organizations: the Initiative of Black Germans, ISD, and Afro-German Women, or ADEFRA. Slide number 6 here shows you 2 brochures. The first one is from, and I should preface too that there are regional groups across Germany of ISD and ADEFRA. And this brochure is from 1989 and the other is from 1993. And the movement, of course, entailed the collaboration of men and women that was pioneered and led by Afro-German feminists. Some of those feminists were Oguntoya, Helga Emda, Abina Aramako, Eleonora Wiedenroth Kolabi, Yasmin Edding, and Judy Gummich. And here are some of those activists. They're also with Audre Lorde again, as well as with Gloria Joseph, and Gloria Joseph's in the back. And she sadly recently died, but was also Lorde's partner before Lorde's death in 1992. Several of these feminists also identified as lesbians and dealt with a double outsider status as both queer and Black. In many ways, Aim, along with other Black women, pioneered a queer diasporic sense of belonging, which literary theorist Nadia Ellis analyzed in her book, Territories of the Soul. Black German women destabilized and defied heteronormative understandings of kinship, the diaspora, and the nation through their activism, and embraced an intersectional political process. As an early leader in the movement, Aim produced and shared knowledge that rooted Blackness in Germany and normalized Afro-German identity. Across Germany, local ISD and ADEFRA chapters also assisted with this task and aided Black Germans as they challenged their erasure from the nation. Their modern movement ushered in a new stage of diasporic activism, firmly rooted in the German nation, even as it extended beyond it. Here again are some more members of ISD. Aim derived a key source of political and emotional energy from her writing. In her poetry, more so than her organizing, that it is her poetry, more so than her organizing, that ultimately gave her international acclaim. She also performed poetry, including spoken word, in major German cities. For instance, Aim read her texts and served as a moderator on a panel about women's literature at the 1988 Women of the World Conference in Berlin. She enjoyed performing for audiences as it was therapeutic and helped to validate her experiences. At the 1993 Frankfurt Book Fair, she participated in Silence is to Blame. German is a colorful language. Schweigen ist Schuld. Deutsch ist eine bunte Sprache, a conference with women of color authors. These events demonstrated how the global intersected with the local, and it also reflected how internationalist themes remain relevant in Germany. Here again is another image of Aim. And this is also an image of Aim with Marseille Condé. Connecting with diasporic writers, Aim also served as a moderator for the 1994 Berlin reading of Guadeloupean author Marseille Condé's newly translated book, The Children of Segu, and later interviewed her. As with other Black diasporic writers, Aim's writing was never devoid of political substance. It enabled her to create links that moved beyond physical interactions. Publishing Blues in Black White as her first poetry volume in 1995, Aim proved that her writing and activism remained inseparable. So Blues in Schwarz-Weiß, or Blues in Black White. Marseille Condé noted in the volumes forward that, in my voice, I found the echo of other sounds of the diaspora. This book represented her position, along with others in the Black European canon. Aim's writing addressed the themes of Black identity, belonging, pain, and marginalization. She also confronted white West German society's unwillingness to accept Black Germans, as well as other communities of color. Reaching across borders, Aim also became a global citizen who traveled to international forums, book fairs, and conferences. With international invitations, Aim garnered acclaim as an Afro-German intellectual and a captivating performer. As Condé expressed, her exceptional voice, unique and already in the hearts of all of us who are thirsty and persecuted. She used her appeal to bolster her position and to retain recognition. Her lyrical use of the German language in her poetry and prose gave her an opportunity to share knowledge about Afro-Germans and to use it to connect with others. These exchanges also encouraged her to seek further engagement with anti-racist and feminist causes across the globe. But this interest did not mean that she was not compelled to accomplish some of this work in other European contexts. Maya promoted collaboration with other women of color throughout Europe. She attended, for example, the 1992 Women of African Women in Europe conference in London. Conveying appreciation to the organizers, Aim saw the event as an opportunity to create a space for African women to get together and to share their experiences and strengthen us in and against a Europe which tries to keep us far from each other and away from power and privileges. This conference, like others, cemented her desire to improve political dynamics in Fortress Europe, a continent that continued to treat non-white Europeans with hostility and that increasingly made European borders impenetrable to refugees and asylum seekers. And again, this Fortress Europe was a common theme in the late 80s and 1990s, and quite common today in terms of thinking about the implications of migration, immigrants in the Mediterranean. So even back then, they were trying to push against these hardening of borders and the sort of draconian approaches to immigration. Participation in this event and others was empowering and reinforced Maya's bond to women internationally. She gave a reading during the International Feminist Book Fair in Montreal, Canada in 1988. At the 1994 Racisms and Feminisms, Differences and Power Relations Among Women, Political Solidarity and Feminist Visions Conference in Vienna, she interacted with feminist scholars from the United States, such as Ruth Frankenberg and Patricia Hill Collins. These exchanges and her reading from her co-edited volume, Distant Ties, positioned her as an important intellectual. Her involvement in these events strengthened her commitment to engage in dialogues about exclusion and to combat discrimination throughout Europe. To further assist her with these goals, she participated in UNESCO, the Council for Europe's Roundtable on Human Rights and Cultural Politics in a Changing Europe, and the Pan-European Women's Network for Intercultural Action and Exchange. So she's very much grounded in working within European contexts. Beginning in 1987, Aim also became a fixture at the Cross-Cultural Black Women's Studies Summer Institute after the United Nations Decade for Women in 1975 to 1985. These cross-cultural institutes formed with an emphasis on the collective experiences of women of color and global feminism. And of course, in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that she was at the 5th annual Cross-Cultural Women's Studies Institute. So taken together, these events demonstrate Aim's willingness to instigate social change. She continued her transnational political activism, further participating in North American and African events that focused on racism's global impact. At the University of Minnesota's 1994 International Conference, Xenophobia in Germany, National and Cultural Identities After Unification, she drew attention to intolerance against German minorities and presented a keynote address, Racism and Resistance in United Germany. And here we have a brochure from that, actually her brochure from that exact conference that she participated in. At the University of Minnesota's conference, she connected with scholars such as writers Leslie Idelson and Uli Linke. And these are also sort of prominent Germanists who focus on different aspects of Turkish German literature, as well as race and representation in German contexts. She gave additional talks at Carleton College, Earlham College, DePaul, and other institutions. At Minnesota, she asserted there has always been a great reluctance to use the term racism within the German context. The most preferred term is still xenophobia, or hostility against foreigners. But these terms deny the fact that all foreigners are not equally subject to attack, and that Black Germans are also a target for violence. Later in her lecture, she proffered accounts about the situation in reunified Germany. Aim explained that she was enraged that no one talked about the fact that on one side, people welcomed white citizens from the former East Germany, whereas on the other hand, immigration laws for migrants, especially from 2/3 of the world's countries, were changed. And here she's also, explicitly referenced the change in the German asylum law that occurred. And so in 1992, there's sort of a change in they shifted from a more flexible asylum law, which occurred after World War II, to a more sort of draconian asylum law that made it very difficult for refugees and asylum seekers. But she did end her keynote optimistically, focusing on the examples of multiracial alliances and the anti-racist work undertaken by ISD, ADEFRA, and other organizations. At the second annual Panifest Symposium in Ankara, Ghana, later that year, she continued to enlighten international audiences on the Afro-German experience. She presented a paper entitled People of African Descent in Europe, the Afro-German Experience. In 1995, Aim also gave a reading of one of her poems, Afro-German 1, at the Mega Music Festival in Johannesburg, South Africa. Here is an image of Aim in South Africa in 1994. These presentations not only demonstrate her willingness to impart knowledge about Black German history and culture in diverse forms, but they also reveal how she used these events to decolonize European and Western epistemologies. So here she's not only trying to sort of talk about the experiences of Black Germans, but she's also trying to disentangle this idea that Europe is white. She's really trying to say, look, it's been multiracial, multicultural for centuries. As always, Aim's effective practices of Black internationalism were very much in tune to intercultural connections and diasporic politics. While these international events and performances sustained her, her life often remained difficult. She suffered from depression and spending periods of time in psychiatric wards in 1996. In the same year, she was also diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Just as her career was on the rise, the persistence of everyday racism and sexism had also taken its toll. Given these underlying forces, Aim ended her life on August 9th, 1996, by jumping off a high-rise building in Berlin-Kreuzberg. She left her unpublished works to Hollande, which subsequently published Borderless and Brazen, Grenzenlos und Unverschämt, and Nachtgesang, or Night Song, in 1997. Her death changed the tenor of the movement and shocked many of her family, friends, and colleagues. Black German activist Nicola Lau Al-Samarai said, "Her void is an abyss over which we must learn to tighten our networks in memory and love." In spite of this tragedy, Aim left a rich legacy as an Afro-German intellectual and activist. She cultivated networks of Black Germans and other people of color in Germany and across the globe. She, along with other Black Germans, certainly created a cultural moment with the modern Black German movement. Moreover, her writing informed her transnational activism. Attending symposia, workshops, helped Aim use her international acclaim to gain more recognition for Black Germans and to address issues of bigotry in Germany and Europe. Through her work, she demonstrated how local, national, and international events were certainly intertwined. Aim's activism underscored how her embodied Black internationalism impelled her to cross borders, showing how she was truly borderless and brazen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. I'm really excited about your next project, which I know is going to be really focused on sort of thinking about my Aim's life and legacy. And I guess like that's where I'd love to just start our conversation today. Can you say a bit more about, I'm just kind of thinking about in your book, you talk a lot about reckoning and excavating and expanding a kind of Black German art, what you describe as a Black German archive. But I guess I'm really curious about like, if you could tell us a little bit more about like finding my Aim and like what that archival journey has been like thus far, and what are some of the challenges, what are some of the opportunities, what are some of the things that are opening up for you in terms of trying to write a history and trying to sort of excavate and curate a history in terms of your previous book, but also where you're headed now with your next book project.
Yeah, those are really good questions. Yeah, it was so interesting. And so it was like an auspicious moment. There was Regina Stein as a Black German activist who was in ADEFRA, one of the organizations that I mentioned, and she was moving out of her Berlin apartment. And she's like, come and get these boxes. And what these boxes were basically over 20 boxes of my Aim stuff, just sitting in her basement for like over 20 years. And so we moved these boxes from one Berlin basement to the next. And then they're certainly now at the FU, the Free University, along with the Audre Lorde collection that's there. So there is an Audre Lorde collection there and a Maya Aim collection there. But it was sort of just by chance that like I was living with someone who was connected to Regina Stein, who then we both I drove in her car, we both kept moving the boxes into her basement. And it's from there that I found that she had all of these international connections, like pamphlets, plane tickets. She also had, she was trying to learn Spanish. She was also trying to learn a variety of other languages. And then she had a card catalog of her sort of own thinking of works. So in one of the card catalogs, she was critiquing Fanon. It was like, where's the Black woman? She was like, wo ist die schwarze Frau? And it was like, it's like then that I realized, okay, this is this is going to be in some capacity in the book, but not in its entirety. And so I think that's what I'd like to do in the larger project, is really focus on her ideas, her thoughts, and most importantly, I'd like to focus on her struggles. She had a lot of mental health struggles that we oftentimes don't necessarily address fully. And why was that the case? I speculate it's not only about racism. I also speculate there's some interesting dynamics about her queerness, which is also something that I wanted to tackle in her in the biography. So I think I have that cadre of material that I can work from. I also am very much keen to talk to her friends in Germany and outside of Germany. So there are a variety of people, several who've reached out to me already. Are you going to talk to me? Because I knew her.
That's always good.
So I was like, yeah, I was like, I will. Will you talk to me? I'll certainly talk to you. And so that's intriguing too, because I think one of the chapters that I'd like to write is her community speaking out, like her community talking about her importance. And her community really was her chosen family. And so really allowing them to sort of talk about their relationship to her and what she meant to their ability to survive in this increasingly hostile space of Germany and also in other parts of Europe. So I'm really, really happy to sort of shift in that way. But it's also like there's so much that I have that didn't go into the book that I like now just have to like re-examine and sort of think about, okay, where would this fit? How would this fit?
So I guess to that point, and maybe this is, I'm thinking about, you're situating her within historiographies of Black internationalism and histories of the Black Atlantic and the Black diaspora. And, how does thinking with someone like Maya Aim and sort of thinking about queer Black women, what do you imagine that her life will do in terms of opening up the way that we think about Black women's history? Because I just think there's so many narratives about Black women's history that also are kind of embedded in her life that aren't part of our kind of evolving canon of what that field looks like, really, on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I'm just really curious about that as well, and what, I think about, where we were with, Darlene Clark Hine and kind of a culture of dissemblance. And there's a way in which some of the things that you are putting on the table are kind of like, just really like exploding our ability to kind of think about interiority, think about intimacies, thinking about Black women as not just through the frames of a kind of public narratives of respectability. And so I'm just curious about how, as well, I think, there's a lot to be said about what her life will do in terms of the ways that we think about Black women's history.
Yeah, Kennetta, you're amazing. And you're like, you articulated things about the project that I don't even think I'm ready to, that I'm even ready there to go.
It's so rich. It's just so rich.
I was like, I can't believe it. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, but I do think in a way, because that aspect of her there, but also not so there. Like it's visible, but not visible. Like it seems she helped to curate. Can you guys hear me? Am I cutting it out?
So it's cutting in and out. Okay. I think there you are.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry, my internet may be a little crappy right now, but I think she represents in some ways this idea of respectability, because she does keep some of that queerness. I don't want to say hidden because people knew, but I don't think it's one of the things that she like openly discussed, even though she does address it in her poetry. Like there's some poems where you're like, okay, this says something about a queer sense of self, or this desire for same-sex relationships. So I think there's something there that I need to really tease out. And she is involved in that DEFRA, but then she's also not involved in that DEFRA as much as, say, women like Katerina Montoya or Rhea Cheatham or others. So like, there's something to be said about her being a part of it, but also maybe distancing herself from it. And in terms of this larger, this larger narrative of Black women. I don't think, especially in the German context, we think about Black women in the same way that we do in the US, Britain, or France. Like, at least we have like these models of Black women's activism and ideas really in the canon. Like, we have this so basically a model to look at. And that's certainly been the case in terms of my own work, but like, I think IEM represents a true model for the German case, of which Black cultural studies have always been an important part in how Black Germans were able to create Black German studies more broadly, but also to initiate change. And so they're using those tools. And so I think she represents this larger example of like, look, there were prominent Black women in Germany. Mai was prominent, Katharina's also prominent. There's much to be said about their relationship. I think in terms of their ability to collaborate and really get, this movement going in so many interesting ways. And so I really want to use her to, much like you were thinking about your own work, like to use her as a lens to sort of think about these larger issues in the German context. So thinking about like the coup in Ghana, she's, the coup in Ghana, she's 6 when we think about that. Thinking about 1968, she's 8. So thinking about how do we see her when we look at these larger historical moments, particularly in the German context, because we have, Shirley Graham Du Bois coming to East Germany after the coup. So like, how do we see her in relationship to these larger moments of larger historical moments that are connecting individuals in the diaspora? So I'm trying to really think about her through those moments too, to really situate her as a really important Black figure, and that all of those moments, even though she wasn't involved, have an imprint on her life in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's sort of the interesting piece about, right, we were talking, briefly before we started about, thinking about like how to write a biography, and there's just so many ways to do that. But also, because I feel like, there's a way in which people kind of maybe shun you from like, focusing on a biography, but then there are all of these ways in which, this is probably like a poorly framed comparison, but if you think about it, like through the lens of like Forrest Gump, and you like begin to kind of,
exactly.
position, and you're like, these are the worlds in which these individual lives interacted with, and like, what does it mean to see those things through their eyes, given the dynamics of what can be known about their lives. And I think that it does become a really powerful way of kind of reinterpreting and kind of accounting for perspectives that oftentimes aren't accounted for when we're thinking about these sort of the grand sweeping narratives of history and certain kinds of historical conjunctures. So I think, again, that makes it really, really kind of fruitful to think about. To your point though, about, there's something about, situating this story within the context of a kind of Black German experience. And I guess I would love to hear you say a bit more in relation to just your wider body of work about, the work of, kind of thinking about Germany within the context of a broader conversation about Blackness globally and anti-Blackness globally, past and present. And I would sort of, you mentioned in your book, you talk a lot about sort of Michelle Wright and sort of thinking about how Germany is one of these places that kind of interrupts, some of the places that have become kind of dominant in our imaginaries about, where Black history happens, or where conversations about racism, anti-Black racism happen in the world. And I'm just kind of, I'd love to hear you say a bit more about the importance of thinking with Black geographies in a German context, in some of that broader kind of conversation, and how your work is really trying to, I think, really at the fore of opening up even more of those conversations around that question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kennetta. And I feel like your work does a lot too in terms of thinking about politics and kinship and just challenging what, Black politics actually means in the post-45 period. In the German case, I think Mai was part of a group of, or this sort of generation that helped to excavate Black history in the German context. Like, she literally wrote an MA thesis on the long lineage of Black people dating back to the 13th century. And so she, along with others, were like, look, we've been here. So we need you to know we've been here, and that we're not just a 20th century dynamic. There's a longer lineage of Black people in the German context, and they've been agitating for change in a variety of ways. They've been really sort of pushing what human rights can mean, what civil rights can mean from the colonial period, also thinking about individuals of African descent who came over from the Revolutionary War, they're basically the free enslaved individuals who moved to Germany in the 18th century, who live in the region called Hesse. So they're referred to as Black Hessians. They're really trying to reconfigure through the historical research and the sociological research of Black people in Germany to sort of show that like Blackness has always been multifaceted in the German context, and it has always meant a variety of things that have helped to push what German identity could mean. And so I see her as a part of that generation who was like, look, we're not just here because, of the war. We have a lineage. We date back to, quite frankly, for some of her research, she's like, look, we date back to the Roman guards. Like they're Black Romans who were in German territories before Germany becomes Germany in 1871. So I think all of that work helps to really reimagine what Blackness can mean in the European context, because it also is not necessarily tied to colonialism in the same way. Colonialism is a component, but when we think about the 13th century, when we think about, Black Hessians, this is also, is an indirect relationship to colonialism, really. It's really them sort of carving out their space. It's not tied to the Middle Passage. It's not tied to, more traditional diasporic narratives about imperialism, colonialism, the Middle Passage, and that's that sort of geographic space of the ship. And so I think this is what's interesting about the Black German case, is that it shows us a variety of examples of how Blackness manifested in the German context and what those individuals did to try to sort of carve out spaces for themselves in interesting ways. Even during the Nazi site. So you have Black Germans riding the Pittsburgh Courier saying, hey, I'm a Black German surviving. I am surviving in my small town because my neighbors know me and they're protecting me. So like, there's something to be said about those different components of engagement with the world that aren't necessarily wrapped in sort of this narrative of the Middle Passage plus epistemology, which is what Michelle Wright refers to. And I also think it's important to show that like, we always see like Britain, France, and in some cases we see the Dutch as these examples of like sustained anti-colonialism, in terms of like, we see figures fighting against European colonialism in those contexts. We see anti-colonialism, we oftentimes don't see Germany in that narrative, that like anti-colonialism was actually an ongoing thing. It doesn't stop after 1919. Even though Germany loses its colonies, it doesn't mean that like, former German colonials are like, choose, we're done. It's a sustained project of anti-racism and anti-colonialism that continues to this day, with discussions about the Humboldt Forum, which discussions about Namibian genocide and colonial memory. And so like, this is all a part of that longer legacy of anti-colonialism that in the German context is really not focused on as much.
Yeah, I think that is like because I'm even thinking about my imagination of like histories of decolonization, and actually like the German context and it's like I have a narrative of a loss of colonies, but I actually don't like situate Germany as well in the narratives of like where decolonial politics, or even just sort of the kind of cultural politics of decolonization play out. And so I think that's a hugely kind of important context to kind of think about, not only just the sort of specificities in terms of the ways in which we think about race and racism, but like, again, like even just the narratives of colonial, like, because like I said, it is a kind of way in which to think about anti-colonialism, but it does not, and even the kind of the time frame, you know, it's almost like a disjointed time frame. It's not linear in the same way in terms of thinking about, it's not like, you know, the way that the story unfolds in the UK in a kind of very, you know, the kind of formal political process is happening alongside this kind of rethinking of this loss of empire, all simultaneously kind of playing out together. So that is really, I think that's really hugely important and just interesting in terms of how we think about the legacies of colonialism and how they play out. So yeah, that's again, that's I didn't even think about, you know, how much you just don't think about the German space as part of like conversations about decolonization.
No. And I mean, even the Dutch case comes in a bit later in terms of thinking about like Indonesia and Suriname, but they still factor in terms of these larger discussions of it, you know, decolonization and anti-racism. But like the German case is like, they lost their colonies in 1919. They lost their colonies.
Yeah, exactly. That it's just, you know, lost and that there's not a kind of legacy of loss to still kind of grapple with and what that looks like in different ways. So that's really, I think that's a really, really interesting point. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on about what you said was the importance of and obviously you and I are both historians, so I'm like, I also just kind of love thinking about like the function of Black history and how important like the kind of making and curation of Black history was to this kind of activist currents that you trace in your book, but also in Maya Angeim's work, that like you know, she very well could have been considered a historian as well, and how important that was. And so I guess in terms of thinking about the making of a kind of social movements that are sort of advocating about the position of Black people in German society, can you say a bit more about just the role of history?
Yeah, no, I think I was struck by how much history was a part of that movement. And it's not only like in Fahrbekennen, which is one of the volumes that they published, but was also at the Black History Month events that they would host every year. They would have these historical seminars, educating an audience about the diaspora and, you know, thinking about not only the civil rights movement, thinking about colonialism in Ghana, thinking about South African apartheid. So they really use history as a tool to not only educate the audience themselves in sort of consciousness raising workshops, but they're also using it as a function to sort of to push change. And I think I say they're trying to push change in the way that they're literally trying to decolonize Western knowledge, German Western knowledge, that presumes that the continent of Africa is devoid of culture and knowledge and history, and that these individuals aren't able to actually, you know, contribute to a political culture or a public culture. So they're challenging that by these different ways to educate the public through history. They're using history as a tool. So it functions not only as like an effective tool in ways, but it also functions as a way of like really pushing against German whiteness more broadly too, because they also have I think they also have panels about Black European history and at these Black History Month events, and they're very much keen to sort of look out while also looking in. And so history functions as a connective tissue, but also functions as a political tool to change when, you know, German thinking. They're like, look, race has been central to German statecraft. These are the variety of examples of this. The diaspora has been vibrant. These are the variety of examples of this. Like, we cannot forget that. And this is why I think they're like intellectuals, like, because they're creating and disseminating knowledge. They're doing it in the everyday, and they're making the everyday an intellectual site. Which I think they certainly, I don't think, you know, one of the individuals who I maintain close contact with, Ricky Reiser, was like, you did a good job in the book. And I was like, I did? And she was like, she's very afraid. So I was like, she's like, yeah, I think so. And I was like, okay, because I see them, and I still see them as intellectuals, everyday intellectuals who are really carving out spaces through the use of history. They're
Yeah.
documenting it. They're documenting instances of racial violence. They're creating a paper trail to sort of show that, look, this is the historical moment of now, and this is how we must remember it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I definitely love what you just said there. I have one more question that I was going to ask, and I want to just encourage folks to add questions to the chat before we close out the hour. I definitely would like to get more questions in from the audience members. But I guess related to, and why am I feel like all of a sudden I'm losing my train of thought? But but
I feel like that.
related, I know, related to that question about you know, casting, sort of using the term intellectual, and you use the term in your book like quotidian intellectuals, and trying to kind of think about the everyday knowledge production and knowledges that are being cultivated and curated, and in way and are, which are also again critiquing very sort of Eurocentric Western knowledge formations. I guess one question I would love to hear you say, you know, a little bit more about is like, what can we in the academy, which, you know, where we oftentimes, you know, suit up as this thing called intellectuals, you know, what can we learn from, you know, thinking through the life and work of quotidian intellectuals that you write about, and like how, you know, how can we kind of learn from their practice in these settings where, you know, there is an expectation of being whatever this thing is called an intellectual, which oftentimes we think is associated with some sort of credential or an attachment to some kind of particular kind of knowledge of, you know, producing sort of socially recognized knowledge producing space. And I guess, you know, what's the I oftentimes, you know, I think there's so much to learn. And I think, you know, even in my own work now, in the UK with the center that I work with, I'm just learning a tremendous amount that's shaping my own practice from people who have no desire to ever be in a university, you know, don't have any desire to, like, you know, affiliate themselves and their archives with the archives that, you know, we may be trained to go and engage with. And I guess you know, I think that is such a rich part of your work. And I think that the people that you write about have so much to tell us about our own practice in these kind of formal intellectual spaces. And I would love to hear you say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think they're very much, many of them were not in the academy. Many of them were doing this because they wanted to. Some of them were certainly university students. Some of them were not. I certainly was trying to get her PhD, but others were researching, excavating Black German history on their own. And so what the project really reminded me of in my conversations with Black Germans too, is that intellectualism is everywhere, that they were creating it, but they were also making sure that we needed to know that the everyday could be a site for intellectual activism, and that it could be a vibrant site in the public culture. And then what's also interesting about them too is that for many of them, doing this work was not an obligation. They didn't feel like they were obligated to do this. They felt like they felt like it was a necessary thing for them to do, in terms of curating, in terms of excavating, in terms of documenting, in terms of creating a diasporic calendar that recognized the different births and different opportunities across the diaspora, and creating a bibliography. I think for them, it was like, we need to show Germany that, like, we have already been thinking Black. We've already been doing this kind of work. We need to push Germany to see why these things need to be more mainstream. And then it's also interesting to think about, like, there's these current debates in the German context right now about German colonial memory and the Holocaust. And what my work reminds me of is that the same debates that are occurring now, Black Germans were already excavating and talking about. So they're already talking about the need to recenter discussions about the Namibian genocide and the repatriation of bones and the what restitution looked like, what reparative justice can look like. This is 30 plus years ago that they were doing the work. And so they're not centered in these mainstream discussions about German colonial memory. And that's, I think, a problem, because Mai was working through this in her poetry. Others were working with activists to try to sort of create more knowledge about the Namibian genocide. And this was in the 80s, this was in the 90s. And so it's important that they did the work that they did outside of the institutions, because those institutions were not inclusive. Those institutions were not open to some of the practices and the ideas that Black Germans and other Germans of color were offering. And so I think this is why we have to really be cognizant. This is why I tried to push at the German Studies Association too, is that we need to be cognizant that activists are intellectuals and they come with knowledge that is important to these institutions, even though they are oftentimes outside the institution because of the paucity of resources, whatever the case may be, but that they're intellectuals and they're creating a variety of epistemologies that we need to recognize. And so I'm always reminded of that when I talk to sort of Black German activists like Ricky Reiser or Ria Cheatham or Katharina Montoya, that like these women were intellectuals. They remain intellectuals. They're still curating. They're still producing art. They're still reading. They're bibliophiles. They're collecting every aspect of, diasporic literature and a variety of, bookshops, etc. So all of this is shows you the dynamic nature of intellectualism within the Black German movement. That shows you that like it's not tied to universities alone. It's never only been tied to universities alone.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I can see additional questions in the chat. And Tony, I know you're there. I don't mean to to call you out, but I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat here.
No, but I actually I have a question. How did your research of some of the women, and particularly the work of some of the women you write about, how did it impact or influence your own writing?
Yeah, Antonia, that's a really good question. It totally influenced my writing because I felt, first of all, I felt that they felt comfortable enough with me to talk to me about their experiences and to share their sources. So they basically were like, would this be of interest to you when I was writing the dissertation? And so I was like, I felt like I really needed to honor their work. And I needed to honor their work in a way that would really bring to light the wonderful contributions that they made. But it was also like a tricky balance too, because I'm like, look, they're intellectuals. And in my conversations with them, they're not describing themselves as intellectuals. They're describing themselves as activists, grassroots activists who just wanted to get it done. And that they were unabashed by working with their Black German brothers to do so, which is why they say we differ from white West German feminists who were keen on working with white German men. And so that was also a tricky part where I was like, I think they're intellectuals, but they're not seeing themselves as intellectuals. And how do I write this in a way that is attentive to those dynamics, but also is attentive to my interpretation that they really are intellectuals, regardless of the label of intellectual being used. And so I think for me, it was sort of trying to have this balance of being true to the interpretation, but also being true to their contributions. And I sent copies of the book back to individuals who were just really helpful for me. And so to hear their perspectives was nice, because I was like, oh my God, they're probably going to think, what is she writing about us being intellectuals? But the fact that they were like, oh, okay, this works. And another person said that I captured the moment quite well, that it was like that. And I was like, oh, okay, good. Like that's a high
huge
praise.
Compliment.
Yeah, I was like, oh my goodness, that's high praise. That's high praise. So yeah, I'm thinking about them always in the back of my mind, because many of them are still alive, and so I want to do the movement justice, but also do right by the interpretation as well. That like, look, they are intellectuals, even though they may not refer to themselves as such.
Yeah.
I hope that answers it, Antonia.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also actually had one other question, because you mentioned as well that Maya Yim, she went to London, and do you know what some of her impressions of London were, and whether you could talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm going to do that in the second project. So she forges a connection with John LaRose, who is a Black British activist. So they were friends, and he also sort of wrote a letter to, I think, Dagmar Schultz when she died, to say, to send his condolences. And she also helped to co-found this organization with John LaRose about against racism. So it's just like a European anti-racism organization that they founded together. And so the next project is me digging into her London time a bit more. I have to go to London to the George Padmore Institute to go through some of those resources to check out. But she loved going, so she would go to conferences and readings, and she liked London a lot. She was invited quite a bit to London to give a variety of conferences, and mostly she was invited to a lot of cultural events. So she would perform her spoken word poetry, and she liked London. I think it was a vibrant space in terms of the diaspora for her, like, a space that was like, wow, exciting. But she also saw it as a way to connect with others politically, to sort of challenge what she and many of that time referred to as a dynamic of neo-fascism emerging, and in terms of approaches to immigration, approaches to non-white European citizens. And so it was a political space for her, as well as giving her like energy in terms of her own poetry and work. And she meets so many people from the diaspora in London. So like she meets Linton Kwesi Johnson, June Jordan, like Margaret Bubsby. She's meeting all of these really amazing people in the diaspora in London. And so it becomes a really important space for her. I hope that answers it.
I think we're still waiting for some questions to come in, so I'm happy to ask another one in the meantime, because I know that you speak about this a bit in your book as well, about there was a sort of difference in then Eastern and Western Germany, and I wonder whether you could possibly expand a little on that, because I know that you talk about it in your book, but maybe for people who haven't read it yet.
Yeah. So I think that was also an interesting thing, that like East and West Germany are not as different as we presume. Ideologically, certainly, in terms of thinking about capitalist West Germany and communist East Germany, but in terms of their approaches to race, they're actually quite similar. And that was striking to me in terms of the silences of race in both sides, and the claims for equality in both constitutions, both the East German and the West German constitution, and the presumption that Nazism, race is gone. We don't have to really talk about it. We don't have to fixate on it. We can move on. And the reality is it's still on the ground. It still has material impacts on how they perceive Namibian SWAPO activists, how they perceive Vietnamese guest workers. So there's silences with regards to race on both sides of the border. But I think East Germany also liked to, it had a solidarity politics that really helped it to push these discussions of, anti-racism and anti-colonialism to the fore. And it's like diplomacy, while it was still on the ground, perpetuating racism in the everyday. So I think they're more similar than we give them credit for. So even though they're like forging solidarity with Angela Davis, we need to free her in the East. And it becomes like a state project. Like East German government officials are pushing for the liberation of Angela Davis. West German officials are not doing that. West German student groups are doing that. There's a different approach. But there still seems to be this claim that like racism is really a US problem on both sides. It's not a German problem. So this is why we need to help African Americans, because look, they're dealing with fascism in the US. And then, the same thing can be said about West German students saying, look, West Germany is also fascist like the US, because look, we have US connections in terms of military bases and the sending of men to fight in, Korea, Vietnam, etc. So I think in many ways we need to really talk about them as being certainly different ideologically, but in ways they're very similar culturally with regards to their discussions and the lack of discussions about race.
Yeah. I feel like there's like an edited collection that I want to like read one day about how the Free Angela Davis movement, how it works like in different spaces globally, because I think what you just said about that is so interesting, and there's a lot to be said about how that works in different parts of the world. So that is, yeah, hugely, yeah, like I said, that is really huge. All of these connections are, and even the John LaRose, who, if you're connected to John LaRose, you're like connected to so many different networks, because that I don't even know where to begin in the Padmore Institute with all of those kind of, and Linton Kwesi Johnson and Gail, like all the folks that you mentioned in those networks in the UK. Again, they are also, you know, sort of indicative of a much broader and wider set of diasporic connections. So I think that is what makes the work just super compelling, and sort of, you know, following these people just kind of, sometimes I'm like, did they ever sleep?
I know, and they didn't have internet. Like, I'm thinking about, like, this is old school telephones and photocopies.
Yeah,
like
letters and like
letters. Yeah, like this is not like, hey, let me go to do this now. I could do this digitally. No, this is like knocking on doors, advertising in newspapers, magazines, etc. Word of mouth, phone calls. I'm in awe of what they were able to do with not, you know, we have so much more technology now that allows, I mean, I think part of the amazing developments with Black Lives Matter last summer was like that digital component of like able to contact people through Twitter, through Facebook, etc. And then you had like massive turnouts across the UK, across Germany, across France, etc. But that was not the case back then. And that's what's so compelling, that literally they're writing each other. They're, you know, they're telephoning each other. And that's, yeah, I think I'm excited about that part of the project. It's like following these webs of people that she knew.
Yeah. I'm excited about the next phase of it. Well, I guess our audience has been soaking it all in. So I don't know if there are any, I'll give a, you know, kind of chance for any final questions or anything like that coming in.
I promise I won't bite. Because I'm on Zoom, I can't do it anyway.
I think you're right. I think everyone's taking it in. Last chance for questions. Nothing's come through, but it was such a pleasure to host you. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your time with us, for taking the time to share your insight and research with us. It was a real pleasure, and thanks also to everyone in the audience for coming and for taking it all in. And a recording of the event will hopefully be available on our website soon, so you can always revisit the conversation. So once again, a warm thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening.